Thank you all for coming today. We are welcoming here Rick Schulting. I hope that I'm pronouncing it correctly. He's professor in scientific and prehistoric archaeology at the University of Oxford, and his main research interests include the transition to farming in Western Europe and evidence for social differentiation among hunter-gatherers and early farmers. He made an extensive use of stable isotopes to reconstruct diets and radiocarbon dating to provide robust chronological frameworks with the application in Europe, Chile, the Bahamas, and southern Siberia. Another research thread involves skeletal evidence for violence in small-scale societies, and I think that today that's what he's going to talk about. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Ellen. Right, welcome. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you to Eleanor for the organizers for the invitation to speak. So yes, I will be talking about ongoing work in Lake Baikal. I am the tip of the iceberg, so this is work being done in collaboration with a host of colleagues. One of whom, at least, Rory, is sitting in this room. So this does contain human remains. This shouldn't be surprising with a talk that focuses on violence, because we have to show the bodily evidence of this. The research is unpublished, so please don't share images on social media. So I'm going to talk about, or try to convince you, that we have in Shamanka what we can legitimately term a massacre. I'm not going to worry too much about that definition, which is maybe a slightly odd place to start, but we can talk about that later if you wish. Certainly there are cases from the Neolithic and later periods where farming is involved, where there are unquestioned cases of massacres that have been put forward, going back in, at least in European archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, to Talheim, first published 1987, where we had, I think, 34, 36 men, women, and children with evidence for violence killed and placed haphazard into this pit, which is very atypical for the linear band ceramic cultures of this time in Central Europe. And then since then, there's sort of been this floodgate of other examples of this, some of which are shown here. Herxheim, the ditch on the right, has a question mark over it, because there's still some debate over the interpretation of that particular site. Certainly body processing is involved, so violence to the body in some form. But there's a deeper question here. If we go back pre-farming, so pre-Neolithic cultures, that what are the origins of violence and what we call warfare, so organized violence of lethal intent between groups. How far can this be traced back into prehistory? And this is where work on hunter-gatherers has been so important, because they're going to be the point of that debate. I think once farming kicks in, everyone accepts that things do go wrong on occasion and people fight. So, but prior to that, there are basically two camps of this, and sort of glossed as hawks versus doves. I don't find that terribly helpful, but it's a nice graphic to show. I mean, it made a point at the time, but I think that time has passed. I think, you know, there are both hawks and doves in the real world, and something in between is probably more realistic. So when we look anthropologically at hunter-gatherers, I mean, we probably have images in our heads. It might depend on our own training and background as to what those images is. But for a long time, and for a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists, it was small communities living essentially very peacefully, highly mobile, and it's even hard to define a social group that you could be fighting with, because everyone is interconnected, moving around all the time, and there's not too much of a sense of an us versus them in a lot of these small-scale societies, or at least that's how the argument went. But there are other hunter-gatherers out there in the ethnographic literature, including the First Nations of Western North America and Canada, closer to where I'm from British Columbia, where we know that very early accounts recorded extreme violence, warfare, capturing of slaves, raiding for trophy heads, which is actually what you can see on the canoes there, with the gentlemen holding up, they're holding up heads after returning from a raid. We know there was an elaborated material culture associated with warfare, so we see this Tlingit warrior on the right-hand side, essentially the equivalent of a knight in armor, wearing the designs on Northwest Coast are not art, they're usually heraldic imagery that relate to ownership and crests and clans. And so again, lots of resonance there with what we might think of as medieval Europe and knights. But then there's an argument over a lot of that material because the simple fact that it's recorded ethnographically means that you're in contact with Western societies, usually Western, and so that you're on the edge of this colonial expansion. And does that create violence? And one of the, sorry if I flip back, one of the books that I started with here, War in the Tribal Zone, argued just that the fact that we record a lot of evidence for violence in the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherers is because, by their very definition, they were involved in the sort of tribal expansion or state expansion and subsequent knock-on tribal expansion. So to solve this question, I mean, this is something that archaeology can very obviously contribute to. We need to look deeper into the past. And there are some examples out there. There's certainly a lot of examples of individual instances of violence, but that doesn't get us anywhere in terms of discussing organized warfare. That's just a homicide, something went wrong, somebody was shot, right? So we need larger group violence. And there are a few cases, including work by Marta published in Nature a few years ago, where this has been claimed. And there was some debate over this, and perhaps there still is, in terms of the timing of that. Is that a single event? And then we have other cases like Jebel Sahaba, which is quite famously for a long time been held up as very early evidence for violence. There is undoubtedly violence there. There's quite a lot. There's a high proportion of individuals show injuries. They have embedded flints. But this seems to date over thousands of years. So this could be just recurrent violence at relatively high levels. It's not necessarily evidence for warfare, not the kind of massacre that we're thinking of or seeing with the Neolithic. Often-volatile is another example, and again, this one is, there's certainly evidence for extreme violence with 34 or 36 heads of men, women, and children taken off. We have cut marks on the vertebrae and placed into these two so-called nests. And there's been controversy over this as to whether that's a single moment or whether this is an odd burial practice happening over centuries, up to 6 centuries, in fact. That's another site that we're currently working on. So to contribute to this debate, and the site that I'll be talking about this evening then, or this afternoon, is from Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. This is famous as the largest freshwater lake in the world. It's very deep. It has endemic species of seal called the nirpa, which is this little adorable little creature shown here. This is just a very quick account of the cultural history. We're going to be looking at the early Bronze Age site, and this is called a Glaskova mortuary tradition, and it dates from around 5200 to 3600 Cal BP. Even though the terms here are early Neolithic, early Bronze Age, these are all hunter-gatherers. It just refers to the presence of pottery to define the Neolithic and bronze objects such as the one shown here to define the Bronze Age. There's some discussion over whether these are actually produced locally or brought into the region, and it is probably actually a mixture of the two. So the specific site I'm talking about on Lake Baikal is called Shamanka II. That's its position right at the southwest end of the lake. It is better known as an early Neolithic cemetery, the monograph of which is about to come out. There have been publications on that site already, so those are all the black symbols there. There's 154 individuals. These are very large cemeteries, but it's the ones circled in red that I'll be talking about today. So there are 11 early Bronze Age graves, and there's a separation of millennia between these two things with nothing sitting in between. So this was used as a very large cemetery in the Neolithic, abandoned, and then rediscovered or reinvented as a place in the early Bronze Age. Okay, so there's just a close-up of the excavations. And one of the points, if this works, yeah, so it was actually discovered along a cliff edge. And we'll see some shots of the site in a second. You can see this individual. This grave here is right on the edge of the cliff, and I think the site was found when leg bones were found eroding out of the cliff edge. Sorry, go back. And so it's possible that actually this was part of a larger site that's been lost as material eroded into the lake. We just don't know that. There are these two groups here. They have about a 15-meter, 20-meter separation. The orientations are slightly different, but I'm not going to discuss that. I think that's insignificant, or if it has some significance, it doesn't relate to the story that I'm telling today. So this is an image of walking to the site. It's quite a striking place in the landscape, which is one of the reasons it probably featured as a burial place both in the early Neolithic and in the early Bronze Age. So the burials are along that line of cliff there, rather than that outermost peninsula that juts into the lake. This is one of our colleagues. This is just looking back along the path that leads us to the site, just to give some sense of the place and the mountains that surround it. And this is now standing closer to the site, looking out towards that extreme peninsula. This is a sacred place to what are now the indigenous Buryat people. They raise these prayer flags there. So in 2019, we undertook excavations there. The previous, so 9 graves had already been excavated in the 2000s, but we always knew that there was an extra part of the site that hadn't been excavated because there was a trigonometry point for the Russian grid survey, the National Grid Survey. And of course, those are no longer in action because everything's done by satellite. So we received permission to dig it in happier times, I must say, in terms of Russian relations. So this is our colleague there. We're now mapping out that little few square meters that's left of the site. The rest of it was entirely excavated, we think. And within that, we found the few burials that I'll be talking about that I'll start with. So sort of starting with the most recent excavations. That's us. This is a very panoramic spot. So we did have these sort of wedding parties turn up. They were slightly bemused as to what we were doing. We were equally bemused as to what they were doing. I'm not sure that's the best backdrop for a wedding, but it's fine. I think there's also a drone flying around this. This was a very strange day. As I give up me being up for 24 hours as well. So this is one of the burials. They're often covered in rock. So quite often in other parts of Lake Baikal, you can actually, the rocks are visible on the surface. Here, there was a little bit of soil development above those, but not very much. We're literally just down a few inches. And the cranium started to appear there. You can see it at the left side of the image. And very quickly, I mean, we already knew there was evidence for violence at this site, but this was literally the first exposure of the first skull on, I think, the second day of work. And we have the proverbial smoking gun. So this is a perimortem injury. This is made in fresh bone. You can tell that already just by its rounded nature and the bone being pushed in. This ended up being a double grave with 2 brothers. That's the initial skull over on the left there. And you can see it's, I should not touch the screen. You can see it's displaced and there's actually a chop mark on the bottom of the skull. It's quite subtle. The bottom of the skull is not that well preserved, but given the displacement, we're reasonably certain that the head was probably removed and just disassociated from the rest of the body a little bit. So these are the fact, yeah, there are 2 brothers, got that. Okay, and we started to very quickly find evidence for projectile injuries on these as well. This is the lower back of the femur on the right-hand side, and the bone's very eroded, but I think you can make out there are some linear striations there. These are cut marks. This is from hamstringing. So this is somebody slashing the back of the leg, which would immobilize you. And we think that's part of what happened to that particular individual. There's arrowheads everywhere. I'll show you a more striking example. And there's always a question when you find these loose in the grave as to whether they may have been embedded into the body. So we found that one, we found that one. And while we're photographing these, we then realized there was one just above that is definitely embedded. So there was no question there. And it's nice being in the fields because the previous 9 graves that were excavated were done very professionally by competent archaeologists, but they never really had a full-time osteologist there looking at the remains with the awareness that you're looking for evidence of violence. And as soon as you have that, it sort of changes the nature of the game. So you find little scratches like this. Well, first you find the break in the rib. I'm not going to touch it. And then you can see the scratch below that. And then you find the projectile point right beside that. So that sort of builds up a fairly clear picture that is another arrow that impacted the body. This is the younger child, the younger individual of that double grave. We can see there's a blow to the cranium, and also we have arrowheads to the top of the, I forget where we are now on that, the top of the femur, immature femur, and through the vertebrae. This is just another example. I like to make this point because there's that arrowhead found in situ like that. But if you lift that, that is the mark it leaves, which I think would be challenging to most osteologists to identify as an arrow injury, right? We would probably just not catch that. And this goes towards a wider point that's been made before. I'm not making this originally, is that we underestimate the evidence for violence in the past, probably quite dramatically, probably by an order of magnitude, because of this sort of thing. So this was the other, so we only excavated, there were 2 graves in that few meters square. This is the second of those. You'll notice there's a lot missing here. This is, was disturbance, recent disturbance, some of it recorded. The missing head is actually from when they put the trig point in. So they went right through the head, and there was a post there where the leg is. But the rest of the individual is intact around that. And just to zoom in on a couple of interesting things, that's just a composite of the torso and the lower leg. We can see that this is a nephrite axe in the middle there. So they were obtaining nephrite from the Eastern Siam Mountains, which is a little bit to the east, and we'll come back to a little bit to the west, sorry. We'll come back to that. There's also a nephrite disc up at the top there that was found in the disturbance area around the skull. So we're pretty sure that was associated as well. And this would be a typical early Bronze Age assemblage to have these nephrite axes and discs. And then also along the leg, we can see there are these small shell beads. Sometimes they're shell, sometimes they're soft stone. And the point with this individual was, as the narrative builds, they were killed quite violently, but they were buried with great care with objects that would be considered valuable, and probably in fine clothing as well, assuming those beads were part of decoration on some leggings. And this individual as well, just so we don't have the head, but we have this evidence for violence on this one, and a possible defensive injury to a phalanx on the left hand. That split there is fairly telling. So those were the 2019 individuals. I'm just going to show a snapshot of a few of the other ones to make some of the same points. Here we have, we found this perforation to the back of the cranium and immediately thought that it was an arrow injury. But it wasn't until about 10 years later, we started work on this at 2012. It wasn't until about 8 years later, I think, that we found the excavation records that recorded a point actually being found there, and it had just been taken away and kept separately because you keep the arrowheads separate from the human remains. So they'd been disassociated and we'd lost that information, but we were already pretty sure about that. The other thing to note here again is they're buried with their finery. So we not only have the shell beads across the face, we've got that green staining. So the bronze object that would have created that staining is gone, but you get the copper staining into the bone as evidence that it was there. So bronze objects, shell objects, nephrite objects buried with these individuals. Here's another one, and here we don't have the arrowhead, but there's a very clear perforation injury to the vertebra. There's also a blow to the cranium that extends down the maxilla. And they're hard to make out on this, but they're linear striations across the forehead that we are pretty sure are scalping marks. This individual, we start to see evidence of what we call overkill. So there's 3 or 4 blunt force injuries to the cranium. There are sharp force injuries to the mandible and to the cranium. And there are at least 4 embedded projectile points. And if I can just maybe pop up, it's these that we're talking about here. There's 2 chops, and one of those actually goes through the mastoid process. So this is a very, very heavy blow with a very sharp implement. And this is curious because there should be nothing in the material culture of these communities that could cause this. This looks like a heavy metal weapon. And there's nothing like that. Even though they have bronze, the bronze objects they have are all small decorative things or small knives. And that's not going to do this. A nephrite axe we experimented with is just possible because you can really grind down nephrite. There's some beautiful examples in the museum here of nephrite being ground down to a very fine edge. The experiments we've done suggest that even that probably wouldn't be sufficient to do this. It's just some of the embedded points. This is that individual, and if you just get your eye in for a second, you'll start to see arrowheads everywhere. And this is them. In all directions, and we suspect that a lot of these were actually in the body. And George Milner did this wonderful study using Native American attacks on cavalry from the 19th century, and he recorded that I think 1 out of every 3 arrowheads struck bone, basically, of cavalrymen that came in and suffered Indian attacks. And so that's sort of the number. You sort of multiply by 3 how many you find. That's probably how many were actually in the body. This is another example here with, you can see it's peppered with even more injuries. We had sharp force injuries again. I don't think a nephrite axe could do that. It's actually removed the process of the mandible. And we have at least 8 projectile point injuries, of which are fewer shown there. And they're coming in from all different directions. Some of these are probably when the body is prone, and others are coming from different directions while the body is still standing. There's a lot of work on that side of things that we still haven't completed yet. And this calls to mind, again, something that has been termed in literature pin cushioning. And this is an example from the Indian Wars of the 19th century. This is one of the battles leading up to the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer met his end. And this is part of native warfare practice. And this is seen in other parts of the world as well. And it's part of a venting of anger. And it's also part of a collective participation in an event where you're really doing violence to someone you consider has transgressed your community. So this is all of the individuals there. There are 2 missing out of it. So we have 13 individuals in total. There are 2 that are not on here because they do not show injuries. One is a neonate and the other is an adolescent female. And those are the only 2 that we cannot find direct injuries on. And the neonate, well, I mean, there's only a few little bones, so you're not going to find anything in a neonate. The adolescent female wasn't quite complete. There were 2 arrowheads in association, but not embedded in the body. I suspect that probably those were the cause of her death. This is the demographic of it. They're overwhelmingly young adult males. We have 3 females, one of whom was the, that neonate male, I think is a mistake. I think that should be a neonate female. And then we have a middle adult female who does show evidence of violence. And the adolescent female doesn't. The others all show evidence for violence. The reason we can sex the neonates and the very young individuals is thanks to Rory and the DNA work that's been done, both by Rory and previously actually out of Eska's lab in Copenhagen. So the question then becomes, so we have a lot of dead people here. This is a very striking place on the landscape. So the question arises, was this just a place for those who died violently? That's maybe liminal, maybe separated from the community. So the question is this a contemporaneous event? So these are the radiocarbon dates, and you can see they are in the ballpark, but they're not really that good in terms of lining up and saying this is a single event. There's also some slight separation, one could argue, between those 2 groups of burials. So there was one called the South Cluster with the 4 that was right on the edge of the cliff. And then this more northern cluster. So there's a slight separation there. And if we Bayesian modeled those as being 2 clusters, it would love that and it would make them distinctive. But we have a problem here. And that is that we know from previous work going back to the 90s that they're eating a lot of fish from the lake. So there's an old carbon effect coming into the bone from consuming fish and those seals. And we know that they were consuming those not only because of the isotope results, but because we find them in archaeological sites. And the Shamanka individuals plot there. So these are at least partly aquatic diets. So varying amounts of lake foods are entering into their diets, imparting old carbon to their bone. Work on seals, comparing seals and red deer from the same levels suggests that could be around 1,000 years difference if you're only eating foods from the lake, right? So that's going to create a real problem in terms of getting a high resolution chronology. So, and indeed, we could demonstrate this from the site itself. So this is one of our individuals who date a human bone, and we come up with 3,700 BP. You date a red deer tooth pendant associated with that burial, and it's 3529. So we have an offset of 170 years. So instead of dating the human bone, we dated the pendants, which not all of them had pendants. So we do have the possibility of using a correction formula that we've developed on a whole series of those kinds of pairings that I just showed you from other sites around the lake. And when we do that, so that's the original plot, treating them as terrestrial diets. If we treat them as if we correct for the proportion of aquatic foods, we get this. So it's shifted them over, but it hasn't narrowed down their range. So this is where we dated instead the pendants. So here now, the ones in green are on associated red deer tooth pendants, which should have no atmosphere, no aquatic foods in their diet. The blue ones are individuals for whom we've done the correction because we never had pendants to date from those. And you can see, with one exception, that very first one, their grave 2, they line up very, very nicely. In fact, they line up. So yes, okay. So there's a question there, is that an earlier individual? Well, thanks to Rory and Eska's work previously, and Peter Demasgarad, we know that those two are actually brothers. So the chances of that grave 2 individual being 100 years older than the other one is pretty minimal. So, but that was a tooth pendant, and so was the one in grave 3 from his brother. So we suspect what's happened there is that tooth pendant was an heirloom, and it had been in use for a few decades. It doesn't have to be in use for 100 years, and that's because the calibration curve have actually modeled this, and about 40 or 50 years would do it, and it would bring it in line with the rest of them. And when I say in line, the crosses there are the median dates. So those are the midpoints of those corrected radiocarbon dates. And they line up at 3788 plus or minus 1.5 cal BP, which I think is not too bad in terms of, radiocarbon dating anyway. That's probably about as good as we're going to get. So I think that's, and if we think that the grave 2 is an heirloom bead, then I think we're pretty solid there. And then, of course, we were able to say that those were brothers because of the DNA work that, again, Rory's been involved in. And we can see here, this is one out of many scenarios, I should say. Rory might speak to this later. This is the one that treats this as a catastrophe based on the archaeological understanding of it. There are other ways to look at this that result in slightly different relationships between a small number of the individuals. But the sheer density of their network is very clear. So we've got 3 brothers there, one in the south group, 2 in the north group. That's the other reason I think that there's not much significance to that spatial separation of the north and south groupings. We have another pair of brothers here, and these are cousins to these. And then we have, they're just all related. And they're related. There's a lot of male relationships here. So these are brothers and cousins. And that's interesting because there's a long-running argument in the anthropological literature that that band of brothers is a strong predictor of the likelihood to violence between groups. Right, because the brothers are they're staying local, so they're developing these dense networks of connections. Where if they had been marrying to other communities exogenously, that you wouldn't have that sort of that bonding together that can make them an effective force for defense and offense should things turn that direction. Okay, so can we say anything about who these people are? We have this, especially in light of the evidence for this trauma caused by weapons that, let's call it a very heavy knife or an axe. We're too early for swords, really, but we're talking heavy knife or axe that aren't in this area. So does this mean these are outsiders that transgressed and were therefore killed? So that's one of the questions we were interested in. So we see here the stable carbon isotope values on top, and the Shamanka ones are on the left, and the stable nitrogen isotope values on the bottom. And they don't really match up too well specifically with individuals from the Angara, certainly not from the Salenga, so that's over here. From the Little Sea is this area here. Their carbon values tend to be too high for their nitrogen values. What this does show, though, even if we can't place them as a specific area, so why should they be coming from here? This might be its own community, right? They don't have to be coming from here. But what it shows is that they are from around Lake Baikal because it has this very distinctive isotopic ecology that includes C13 values that are very elevated that you would normally only see in marine contexts. So we have fish in Lake Baikal that will be -12, -13. But we also have fish from the same lake that are -20. So you're eating a mixture of these and you end up at -16, -17. And that's where you're getting those reservoir offsets are that we saw that affect the radiocarbon dates. So the point is these are not outsiders to the Lake Baikal region. They're local in that sense. It's hard to refine that because one of the problems is, you can see the scale here. This is 100 kilometers. So that's about the distance between this and the next nearest microregion. And the problem with this part of the lake is we have no other early Bronze Age individuals. There's no other cemeteries, there's no other burials to compare them to. Otherwise, we could very easily say these look really local. We just don't have that, which in itself is, it just might be an accident. They just haven't been found, or there's something else going on there. We don't know. So strontium isotopes would be the other sort of go-to isotope system to use to look at geographical origins. We have those for 10 of the 12 individuals. We can't do the neonate because there's not enough enamel had formed. They are quite variable, but then so are the early Neolithic individuals from the same site that we also have strontium isotope evidence for. We're still working on that, so I don't have a graph of it. They look slightly different than the early Neolithic, but that doesn't mean they're not local to that area, because all you have to do is start eating slightly different amount of fish, and the fish have a different value from the terrestrial foods. And you could be local, but it just have changed your diet. And we do know that in the early Bronze Age, they were consuming slightly less fish than they had been in the early Neolithic. So we already know there's a dietary shift there that could account for the slight difference in strontium. But we are doing, especially on Carolina Warren's, my DPhil student, together with my colleague John Ponset, we've sampled hundreds of more plant remains than had already been sampled previously by colleagues on the project, Ian Shalata and Jay Weber, to try to fill in that and see if we can really sort of try to track down where people were coming from. But that's a work in progress, so we don't have too much more on that side of things. So if I can just sum up, I mean, most of these cases, most of these individuals died violently. 3 or 4 we would describe as experiencing overkill. There's a literature on this kind of extreme violence that's often related to the release of pent-up energies after a long conflict. So you have a lot of adrenaline is going through your body, and then you have the chance to release it. And this is a group action where everyone goes into a bit of frenzy. And this has been described in Vietnam by American soldiers who did it, as well as in many other contexts, and books have been written about this. Terms are used, like forward violence is another term for what we were just called overkill. So with that single exception, the dates are consistent to 3788. I'm not going to talk about climate because we can't see any climate event at this time. So we don't think this was caused by a climate crisis, which is probably good news for us. The isotope results so far, and this remains to be fleshed out a little bit more with the strontium, but suggest they're not outsiders to Baikal. Cis Baikal just means Western Baikal, but are local, however local is defined. We have the preliminary DNA results, which show a very high degree of relatedness, especially amongst the males. And as I mentioned, that has some resonance with the anthropological literature on these bands of brothers. This is getting a little bit more, you start to build up an interpretation based on these lines of evidence. I think because we have these multiple arrow injuries, we're talking about an encounter that started at a distance. So I don't think these were defenseless people caught off guard. I think there was something of a conflict first that then became progressively closer. They were overwhelmed, hamstringed, and then the coup de grace was delivered with blows to the head from many of the individuals. But then they were left. We'll come back to that. Well, come back to that right now. They were most likely buried by survivors of their own community, wherever that may be. I should have said earlier, we have very little knowledge of the settlement evidence for the early Bronze Age. This is really, it's a mortuary archaeology. We have these cemetery sites. There's far less known about the settlements. We know they exist, we find material, but there's very little structure to them. It's hard to say, we don't find house pits that we can, sort of look at the size of these communities. So it's quite frustrating in that sense. But the fact that they were buried in the finery in the normal mortuary tradition of this period with these high status items, nephrite and the beads and the bronze, and that brothers were together in the same grave or adjacent graves, show that they knew who these people were, right? So we don't think these were the perpetrators. Sometimes individuals can transgress some taboos and be killed by members of their own community. I don't think this is going to happen with 13 individuals in a single event. And that just stretches the bounds of probability given that these are relatively small scale communities in the first place. Probably upper limit would be maybe 80 or 100 people in a community. That's just purely based on ethnographic analogy with other North Temperate hunter-gatherers, especially with access to aquatic resources, which tends to concentrate communities into larger groups. And so if we use that number, 80, and we've lost 13 members, of whom 10 are young adult males, this is a sizable disadvantage to that community, especially in a context of ongoing conflict, if that was what this was. And that leads to another point, which is that this is not normal for this area. It's not that these people were incredibly violent. We have isolated incidences of violence from the early Neolithic and other early Bronze Age sites, but they are just that, isolated incidents. And if you total them all up, it's about 3% perimortem trauma. I started off doing this work, in fact, in the Duckworth here many years ago during my DPhil, during my PhD, sorry. And we played this game in Neolithic Britain. And when we found 3% died violently, we thought this was a huge number. And in a way it is, because it sort of hadn't been recognized. In other contexts, that number is modest. It's kind of normal. This is a normal sort of hunter-gatherer attritional death by violence. So the Shamanka case is something very different. But I think a really important point here is I don't think this is a one-off event. Things like this have consequences, and they likely had antecedents. Right? This doesn't just happen out of the blue. So these people may have they look like victims, and they are victims in one sense. In another sense, this may have been revenge for something that those people or their community had done. And even if that's not the case, there would likely be a cycle of revenge following on from what had just been done to them. And that would be perpetrated by those survivors and their allies. So we might not see the evidence of this, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. These are relatively low population densities. We don't have all their burial places. You don't always leave the dead in a place for your enemies to find, because you are often out of your comfort area and you're hightailing it out of there. So you want to delay pursuit. So you hide the dead. You don't leave them out there for people to find. In this case, we do think they were left. There's no evidence for scavenging. No, that doesn't mean they were left for very long. And it was probably in the summer because they dug the graves. So no effort was made to hide the bodies. I would call this a message. Violence is about communication. And it's been said, and I probably agree with this, that massacres are always political. And it's very easy to say that in a modern sense, and that's where this quote comes from, or this expression comes from Simlin's work, and others have picked it up. And one of the reasons I use the term massacre, and I haven't defined it, and I'm not really going to, but it's so that we can look at these events in the past and compare them to things that we are more familiar with that are documented and look for their similarities. And I think there are a lot of them. I'm not going to belabor that, but the evidence for overkill, the killing of men, women, and children, all of these happen in these contexts of massacres that have been described, sadly, in many different parts of the world at different times, some of which are very recent indeed. So what brought it about then? Well, I've already referred to revenge. Rating for women, there's an underrepresentation of women in this group, but it's a small group. So statistically, I'm not going to argue for that too much. It's an unusual demographic in other ways as well, in that there's also very few older people. The oldest individual we have is 25 to 35. There's no one, well, there's a 40 or 50-year-old woman. Other than that, everyone is 20 and younger. So that's already an unusual demographic. So we can say that young women are missing, but then so are older men. So it's just unusual in that sense. So I'm not sure about the rating for women. That's up there partly because this had been suggested to us by colleagues, because it is something that features in both the archaeological and the anthropological literature as a motivation for small-scale conflict. So some of those Neolithic sites I started with, Aspern-Schletz in particular in Austria, has a definite underrepresentation of young women there. There's a famous massacre site in the plains called Crow Creek, dating to not too long before the historic period, but definitely before the historic period, where there's also an underrepresentation of young women, and the idea is that these have been taken away. We might also think, however, of conflict over material resources. And of course, revenge, I mean, that's an open-ended book, right? Because revenge for what? Well, you stole my stuff. So it's still going to have an underlying material end. So Well, we know they were into fish and they were into hunting and they were into plant gathering. Normally you don't fight over wild plant resources because they tend to be quite widely distributed. You could fight over hunting territories, but they are also quite diffuse. What you usually fight over if you are a hunter-gatherer who's interested in fishing are the best fishing spots. And Shamanka extends into a very shallow part of the lake. There's a small stream there, but that's not that big a deal, I think. But with the technology available to these people, having a broad, shallow area makes the fish much more accessible to them. Whereas the deep water of the lake is 2 kilometers deep in places. This is why it's the largest freshwater lake in the world. That's not accessible to the sort of technology that they would have had. So it's possible that those were prime fishing grounds. Remember, there was that very large early Neolithic cemetery there as well. But we can think more broadly than this. This is not an isolated community of people just hunkering down around the lake fishing and hunting, because we have evidence for all of that nephrite that I referred to. There's 2 sources of nephrite around Baikal. One is way to the north, and it's a white nephrite, a white jadeite. I'll use the term nephrite. They're kind of all related. There's subtle geological differences. So that material, even though it's from there, is found all over Baikal sites, including the area marked as the little C there. That's coming from 400, 500, 600, 700 kilometers away. And it might be going into China through Transbaikalia there. So if we go to the right of Transbaikalia, we end up in Mongolia. And then it's a hop, skip, and a jump to North Russia, to northern China, where these materials are highly valued. And they're right from the 1950s, a Russian archaeologist named Mukladnikov was suggesting that this material was moving into North China from Baikal. So that's the white nephrite. The green nephrite is coming from the Eastern Sayan Mountains, which if you follow the Tunka Valley to the west of Shamanka, that's where you end up. And the axes that I show there are, some of those are from Shamanka and others are from a variety of sites around there. And we saw the nephrite disc in that grave that I showed. So there's that. And if this is a valued material, it might be that there's conflict over access to it, especially the site at Shamanka seems to be placed as an entry point from material coming from that direction, from the west. And then the other thing, of course, we have are those bronzes. Now, I mentioned that some of those look like they might be made locally. The metallurgical work that's been done on them places those as very pure copper content. These are not very pure copper content. These are not made locally. These are made in the West. These are probably from the Miniscence Basin, and that's really clear with this one. This is from the Little Sea, I should say. It's got such an iconic medallion that I like to show it. That's from there. These other objects are all from Shamanka, from the Massacre. This is from a site called Shumalika, which is on the Angara River, which is buried under our nephrite here. And that was found in one of these early Bronze Age graves, not one that showed violence. And this shape, this is definitely from the Miniscence Basin. They weren't making things like that anywhere near Baikal at this time. Right? So there's definitely that connection. This is another possibly highly valued material. It's used for small ornaments. We have a needle, we have a fish hook, but presumably those have some sort of cachet that may have been worth fighting over. Okay, so I think this qualifies as an act of war. I think it qualifies as a massacre. I put those both into the same sentence. I think we can conclude that warfare is not limited to farming societies. And I call it war because I think this is not an eternal within a community. And as soon as you have 2 groups of 2 different communities fighting with lethal violence, by definition, it's war. Right? The usual argument against hunter-gatherers having war is that you can't define social political groups because they're not supposed to have them. But that's only if you use very highly mobile foragers as your starting point for what defines hunter-gatherer societies. And I think that's mistaken. And I think, you know, it's useful in some audiences and some contexts to keep hammering home the point that there is warfare among hunter-gatherers prior to farming and prior to Western colonialism. But at some point we have to move beyond that. And I think we are there. We have been there probably for a few years. And it's to try to understand more about the conditions under which this resort to violence happens. Climate often rears its head, and I resist that, even though I published something else recently on the importance of climate. But that was Yeah, I couldn't help myself on that one. Anyways, that was not violence, and I don't think, there are predictions of doom that the world is going to descend into warfare, which at the moment may be coming true, but I don't think there's a necessary connection there at all, and it's something to resist, that there is this very simple equation between climate change and, we have to all go fight each other. I don't think it works like that. And one of the things we can do is that we can build alliances. And the fact that this is an unusual event in Baikal, I think it's not a one-off. I think it's also the tip of an iceberg. But still, we have hundreds of graves with relatively normal levels of violence, this sort of 3 or 4% of individuals dying violently. So most of the time, they're able to get along with each other. Sometimes things go wrong, and one of our tasks is to try and understand why that is. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Right. If there are any questions, there is one there.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious about those injuries you said were probably done by metal weaponry. Yeah. Where is the nearest site we have of metal weaponry that's hunted?
Nuisance Basin. But we know at least some of these axes, and this is the sort of axe that could probably have caused that. Those are being traded into Baikal. So we have them in Baikal. So that doesn't mean that these are outside raiders. We did play with that idea, but we just don't know. Yeah.
That was a very interesting talk. Is there any study conducted on the origin of the raw material that was used to perform the arrowheads? Because that might tell something about the perpetrators, especially compared to the locals.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a perfect question. And also the form of the arrowheads. Our communications with have suggested that these materials are quite ubiquitous. So they're made on, I'm going to forget, quartzites. They haven't done any geochemical analysis. And I think probably a lot of these sources, it's a shorthand way of saying we don't really know where they were coming from. Formally, they look local, but again, I don't know how big local is.
Thank you.
This has been a very interesting talk with a lot of possible questions. One of the ones just from the end, if the bodies were left out as a sort of assigned to survivors, does that not sort of counter the notion that they were left by the people that survived them, who were on their side, quote unquote, as opposed to being left by the people who killed them?
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm following the question.
In final slides, you said that the way that the bodies didn't appear to have been buried immediately, that they were left out, and that is an indication that could be a sign that was left for survivors. But earlier you had said that they were likely buried by their survivors.
Yeah.
Because they were buried with fine material.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay. No, the being left as a message, as communication, is the moment of discovery. I mean, that's it. They don't have to sit there for very long. The survivors just have to see that this is what we did to your people, and then they're buried in their finery because you don't like to leave them lying around like that.
Gotcha.
So it's a moment, it's a flash of a message of discovery. I don't know whose hands.
That was really interesting, and a lot of the questions I would have asked you already anticipated, and I really like your interpretation and going into much more nuance about what might have motivated this massacre. Just a simple question, really, in that some of the graves, it looked a little bit like maybe some of the remains or some of the bones were slightly disarticulated, but you say that maybe they weren't left exposed for very long. So is this a result of modern disturbance, or is there something else happening in a delay?
Rick, can you repeat that? Because I don't think everybody at the back heard.
So it's just that some of the skeletons looked quite disturbed rather than being fully intact. So I think I didn't go into this, but there is a tradition in the early Bronze Age mortuary practice of re-entering graves and mucking around with things, not necessarily taking things out, but rearranging things. And there's a really striking example of this that I didn't show there, but that seems to happen elsewhere as well in graves that aren't part of this, like in other areas of the early Bronze Age, in the Little Sea, for example. They seem to open up graves, move the skull around, just move things around. There are also evidence for, because they're quite shallow, there's probably some animal disturbance. So things are getting shifted, but some of them are really quite disturbed. One was falling off the edge of the cliff, so that one obviously we've lost some of. In some cases, the archaeologists didn't actually collect all the remains, so we're not actually sure what was there, and the photographs aren't always that great. So it's a variety of things. Yeah, I think that's about as well as I can answer that.
This sort of contemporary practice of re-entering the grave is carried out no matter how the individuals die.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Well, we don't know. Sometimes skulls are missing, although that's more on the early Neolithic side of this, and we never find the skulls. So we don't, sometimes when things are missing, we don't quite know what they're doing with them. The case I showed with the head displaced, it's because we found a chop mark on the base that makes us think that was actually more forcibly removed rather than a later entry that moved the skull up.
Do any of the bodies have signs of earlier weapon damage, so that which had healed? In other words, they got away with it.
Yeah, very good question.
Suggesting that you've got an endemic warfare.
Yeah, one individual had a small heel depressed fracture. That was it. No evidence for healed projectile trauma, which is a little bit harder to find unless the arrow is sticking in there. But sometimes you can identify. But no, we didn't.
It was lovely. I have many questions. Many have been answered already, which is great. Mine actually follows from Jess's, and the parallels with Jebel Sahaba are super interesting. It's a community. It's at the least you say it's one event, and Jebel Sahaba is a protracted case. But somebody attacks, the bodies are left, the community picks them up and buries them properly. And in Jebel Sahaba, I have pondered how long were they out? How long does it take them to actually dig the proper graves at a cemetery? Presumably they died somewhere else. Line them up with stones, as you have in Jebel Sahaba, bury one or more people, whoever's dead at that moment, cover it all. And in what state do you bring your bodies full of sticking arrows out of it, partly rotten by then, right? So in this case, do you have any sense of where did they die? Where was the settlement? How far they were carrying them in? You have graves there with those stones. Was that, they looked strange, the stones, and then the head appearing to the side of the stones, the relationship of the stones with those bodies? So can you tell us a little bit more about the mortuary process itself?
No, I wish I could. It's a very interesting idea, and it's something we often gloss over, don't we? That's the practicalities of dealing with something like that. I mean, death normally, there's a lot to deal with. This is on another level because you have so many individuals at once to deal with. How far away were they killed? We don't know too much about the settlement archaeology. There's hints that there might actually be something of a settlement not too far from Shamanka, but these are just hints. No excavations really. It's just some stray finds that have come up that look like they're about of the period. And really, but obviously we should have been out there over the last 3 years excavating. So first COVID and then Putin going mad have sort of stopped all possibilities of us doing more field work there to look into that in a bit more detail. The ground freezes here. It's frozen for at least 6 months of the year. So whether the bodies could just remain frozen then and then wait. So that's another possibility. But then during the period of thaw, I would think the bodies would thaw quicker than the ground, but you could build fires. We don't have evidence for that. There's no sort of discoloration around those areas. So we think it's a spring, summer kind of event. The rocks are available locally. The graves are quite shallow. The displaced skull, quite rightly, you mentioned, does look strange. That's the one that we think was chopped off. And that was maybe almost, well, it's hard to think quite why they would have done that if that was the survivors of the community, right? Even if the head was chopped off, why wouldn't you put in the grave. But then this was also part of this particular mortuary tradition where sometimes they did go into a grave and displace the head. So it's a little bit hard to get to understand all of those nuances, I think. So I think it was one.
Oh, we've got a lot. Other questions?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure. Did you suggest that these people come from northern China or they moved to China afterward? Or
The jade.
because the jade and the stone structure tombs were quite popular in northern China, like around 6,000 BP in northern China, a bit earlier than this side, and because the temperature, the climate was quite warm in that period, so that might give opportunities for people traveling from northern China to even northern place in Baikal region. But no question, it's just a hypothesis.
Yeah. No, in this case, the connection with northern China is that it's been suggested that that's one of the sources of nephrite coming into northern China. So that would be a valued item that might be the cause of some local conflict in terms of who's going to supply that. Not that it's a direct link, so it'd probably be down the line kind of exchange. So groups around Baikal would exchange to Transbaikalia, and you wouldn't have to go too far down there into Mongolia where you'd have herders who would have very close connections with North China. So it's more about movement of those materials and how that might be a reason for conflict to control the movement of those materials.
I would say genetically as well, they are quite distinct from the Chinese farmers or the Chinese Neolithic town at that point. I mean, they like kind of very extreme end of an Eastern hunter-gatherer clan, and yeah, it seems like they are quite distinct from a genetic ancestry perspective.
So did you mean that the ancestry from the genetic perspective?
Yes, they're not.
They're not. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does it worry you that all of the deer deeds are exactly the same year? In other words, that would seem unlikely if they were all, the deer next to the case every time, it wouldn't be the same year. It then implied, because it's a dressed individual, so they'll maybe dress after these objects. That also means, because you can see where the graves are, that they could have decided to dress one group and then actually dress their brothers who had died in an earlier conflict at the same time. So it almost like implies that they went out, killed deer, created teeth that year for a record, and that could have therefore meant that it's actually different events.
I think the fact that the median dates lined up so nicely is a little bit fortuitous. And this is a Bayesian model of with the median dates.
So even the minute this, it was pretty damn impressive. I have to say. Those
But I would
lined up.
that interpret that as that actually was the year the deer was killed.
No, but the fact that the deer teeth were all so remarkably consistent implies a single year of collection, and that appears to apply.
I don't think it does. Not with the vagaries of radiocarbon dating. But that would really throw a spanner into the if we could find out the deer were all related. Push that. Well, there's only two incisors for me.
All right, I think we have got still time for a few questions, then we have to move, but yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, I was wondering, I know you said a lot of them were cathartic, like traumas after death, but I was wondering from the way you look at the direction of the blows and arrowheads, could you tell if it was like an ambush or like an open conflict?
Yes, well, they're definitely coming from different directions, whether that makes it an ambush or being confronted with overwhelming numbers. And normally there's a pattern in this kind of hunter-gatherer warfare in the literature, is that if you are going out with the intention of killing a group of people, you bring a lot of friends because you don't really want it to be a fair fight, right? I mean, you want to overwhelm, and that could imply that you are attacking from different directions. The problem there then is that we get this pattern of this overkill where you're shooting arrows into the body when it's already down. You know, when they're on their knees, when they're on their back, you're still shooting into them, partly because you're venting this anger and you're showing that you're participating in this, that you're a member of your community, right? So it's partly, there's a lot of symbolism in that kind of overkill. So we don't know to what extent the person was standing there being shot from 8 different directions. It's just really hard to say. All you have to do is turn and move, and you're hit from a different direction yourself. by the same archer hiding behind in a tree or something. So that game is really hard to play. We could certainly do more with looking at the directions of the arrows. But yeah, it's still going to be hard, no matter what the result is, to answer that question.
So we have a question online before posing the question session. So the individual burial too, I think, with the disarticulated skull, does that presentation match the individual's violent slaughter about the region? Similarly, are the beads, stone weapons, and copper contraband common with the other individual burials? And this is Joshua Fitzgerald asking online.
I didn't understand.
Perhaps you read it too.
Sorry.
It's quite a long question.
No, so other individuals that died violently in the region do not show this level of injury at all. We see like they'll have one arrowhead in them or one blow to the skull. They don't show this over. And then there's something else. Yeah, so these are probably richer than your average early Bronze Age burials in the region, but there are others that are equally rich. But as a group, there's quite a lot of stuff with these. And whether that is part of the message that the survivors were making is that these were valued members of their community being sent off, maybe some sort of hero's death almost, is possible, I suppose. But we don't have a local comparative data set because the next early Bronze Age graves that we have are from 100 kilometers here, 100 kilometers there. So they're slightly different regions, especially if this is closer to the source. That might simply be why these are a bit richer, but there's more material available here of both the nephrite and the bronze, if they are kind of the providers for the lake.
All right. One last question, and then we're.
Yes. So following up on the question on the connection between this side and North China. So in fact, in North China, the Hongshan culture actually is famous for jade carving, and it is known that they have their supply of jade more locally, and the date is actually earlier than this one. So I'm just wondering if there's any work to compare the form or provenance in work for this jade from Baikal with comparing with the jade from northern China. If you suggest that jade goes south.
Yeah, so I said that's a suggestion that goes back to the 1950s, purely based on the fact that there is this jade. I guess some of the jade rings would be found in northern China. As far as I know, the sourcing work that's been done has either been done here or in northern China, rather than something that tries to combine those two. And I've been looking, but I haven't found that connection. And it might be, I don't read the Chinese, so I might be missing something there that's been done that has tried that.
Because, sorry, I just follow the question, because the stone structure tools were quite popular in Hongshan culture as well. So add more similarity, but I'm not quite sure if the crafts also related.
I mean, they're very simple stone cairns piled over the grave, which is very, you can find these around the world. We have them in British Columbia where First Nations people were doing that as well.
All right, so thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rick, for this very interesting presentation.